Okay, what did I say? Colossians chapter 1. And I'd like to begin reading with verse 12. Apostle Paul is writing to the Colossians, and they are Christians just like us, and the same thing he says to them applies to us. He writes and says to them, giving thanks unto the Father, which hath made us meet to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light. I read this last week, and I pointed out to you that the word meet there means, it's a funny usage of the word. We don't use it in this kind of context. In the King James language, or day, in its English language, I guess, but in the days of King James 400 years ago, to use the word meet in this way meant that something is appropriate or matched properly. In this context, it would be better translated, perhaps, for our understanding, fit or qualified. That's the way to understand that. And it's a good thought. It says, giving thanks to the Father. Paul says we should give thanks to the Father because He made us qualified to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light. I meet people from time to time who don't think that, who think that we qualify ourselves, and that some are qualified and some are not, and it's all usually the people who say that. The reason they say this is because they feel like they're qualified and everybody else is not. And so it makes them feel superior to others to say that, but Paul says it's not we who qualify ourselves. He says, giving thanks to the Father, which has qualified us to be partakers of the saints in light. And he's going to talk about that. That's not my message today, but a little further down in this chapter, he tells us how the Father qualified us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light. In fact, that's verse 20. I'll just read it to you. This is not my message. I shouldn't get distracted because I love these verses. Verse 20 says, having made peace through the blood of His cross, by Him to reconcile all things to Himself. By Him, I say. Notice how he keeps telling us that it's by Him, twice there in that verse. Whether they be things in heaven, things in earth. It means He made heaven and earth compatible, reconciled. He did that. And you, verse 21 says, who were sometime alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now hath He reconciled. Now when I meet people who tell me that it's up to us to get ourselves qualified and worthy to be accepted by God, Paul says it's just the opposite here. We were enemies in our minds and alienated, but we didn't make ourselves right. He reconciled us. And here's how, if you want to get specific about it, in verse 22, in the body of His flesh through death. Notice it's His flesh. Everything's about Him here. His flesh through death, comma, and after the comma then it means with the result of, to present you holy, unblameable, unreprovable in His sight. Now when he talks in the last part of that verse about you being holy, unblameable, and unreprovable in His sight, I haven't found anything in any of these verses that tell you to do anything to accomplish that. In fact, what I read is just the opposite, that what He did in the body of His flesh through death results in us being presented holy, unblameable, and unreprovable in His sight. Now, we don't always see it that way, but that's because, I almost said something kind of blunt there. I said, we don't always see it that way. I almost said, that's because we're carnal. But if we would get God's eye view of things, He thinks He's already made us qualified. And the truth of it is, if you think you're going to make yourself qualified and worthy, you're never going to get the job done. You're never going to feel like you've got it completely done. And if it were possible for you to do it, then Jesus didn't need to come and do what He did in the body of His flesh through death. Does that make sense? So that's how He did it. Now go back again to verse 12. And Phil, could you turn me down just a little hair more on that blue recorder? I'm hearing a little ring and it distracts me a little bit. Just a little hair. We run that little recorder in the back to get audio to the camera. Hi, Torrin. Hi, Troy. Okay, verse 12. Giving thanks to the Father, which hath made us qualified, or fit, to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light. And I think if you understand what he's saying there, it does inspire kind of a sense of thankfulness. You know, what most people think they're going to have to spend their whole lives diligently trying to do, He's already done it for us. That makes me want to say thank you. I don't know about you. It's as though you had some daunting task ahead of you, then you find out somebody's already done it for you. That kind of inspires a sense of thankfulness, you know. And see, that also gives you a sense of peace and confidence with God, if you understand that. But that's not my message. Verse 13 is where I want to get the message from today. Verse 13 says, who, and he's talking about the Father here, through what He did to qualify us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness That's a good thought right there. Who hath delivered us from the power of darkness. Let's just stop right there, just for a second. Who hath delivered us from the power of darkness. That means the power of darkness, that represents anything bad. That represents Satan, if you want to say it that way. That represents all of his works, all of his threats, all of his, anything that you could associate with the dark side of things, with the devil, with fallen situation. There's nothing. He's saying he hath delivered us from that power. So that means there's no need to have any worry or fear or concern about that. I heard a sermon one time by Andrew Womack. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's on television early in the morning sometimes. And I heard him tell about how of course he's a traveling minister and goes to speak different places, so he has to fly on the airlines. And he got in this airline, and if you've ever flown, you know that you don't always have control of who sits next to you. In fact, you don't unless you buy the seat. You just sit next to whoever's there. So he sat down on the airline, and this man came and sat next to him. And, not to be judgmental, but just make an observation. This man kind of dressed kind of strangely, and all in black. Nothing wrong with that. I wear black sometimes myself, but he had long, stringy, straggly hair and long fingernails, and just had a kind of a strange appearance. And so Andrew Womack he didn't do anything. He just observed that. He said as the flight got underway, he got his Bible out and began to read. And he found out when he got his Bible out and began to read, this man with the scraggly hair and the long fingernails, who seemed a little bit unusual, got very agitated, got very upset. And he said to him, and Andrew Womack turned to him, and I'm paraphrasing this, I may not be telling this word for word, but I'm going to give you the essence of it. And he engaged him in a conversation, and anything he said to this man just infuriated him. And he just got madder and madder, and finally the man said to him, "Don't you know who you're talking to?" He says, "No, of course not." He says, and he's in a very pompous, kind of self-important way, "I am the high priest of the Church of Satan." And Andrew Womack to that replied, "So what? My God's bigger than your God." And that really made him mad. But he just ignored him. But that's true. See, that's important. Some people might have been intimidated by that. Ooh, the high priest of the Church of Satan, Well, see, it says here, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness. That means, I remember something else I left out. He said, if you don't watch it, I'll put a curse on you. That's what he said. He threatened him. I left that part out. He threatened him. He said, if you don't behave, I'll put a curse on you. He said, go ahead. Shoot your best shot. Put all the curses you want on me. I'm not afraid of your curses. My God's bigger than your God. That's the rest of that. Well, some people, if the high priest of the Church of Satan, whatever that means, or anybody said, I'm going to put a curse on you, that would worry. Some people would get worried about it. But see, you've got nothing to worry about because, what did I read here? Who hath delivered us from the power of darkness. That means the power of darkness, or means anything associated with that, there's no authority, there's no power, there's no legitimate power that Satan or anyone representing him has over you. And all of their curses mean nothing. Mean nothing. Powerless, empty, void words. So, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness? And, here's the part I actually wanted to get to, hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son. Hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son. Now, I would dare say that most Christians in their minds imagine something like this taking place when we die. We imagine dying, going to heaven. That's true. That's a reality. That is a fact. But it says here, if I read this right, past tense, who hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son. So that means, setting aside what happens when we die, and what happens when we die is, Paul said, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. That's what happens. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. But the reason that's true is because we've already been translated into the kingdom of his dear Son. Now, you notice that bodily we're sitting here in this earth, and a person might say, looking around, well, it doesn't seem like that's true. Well, again, like I said before, if I wanted to be blunt about it, that's only thinking about it in a carnal way. But he says, all I can do is rely on what he says here. It says hath, and that's past tense. He has already translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son. Hath is past tense. He's already done that. Well, it's interesting thought to think about. And evidently, he's not talking about a physical thing, although it has all kinds of effects on your physical life if we understand and rely upon that. But in some sense,